In 1870, a photographer working from Mount Washington, New Hampshire, captured something on film that had no business existing: a dark, circular object hanging motionless above the summit. This was 5 years before anyone achieved a successful glider flight, 33 years before the Wright brothers lifted off at Kitty Hawk. That photograph still sits in the New Hampshire Historical Society archives. No one has ever adequately explained what it shows. And what makes this more than a historical curiosity, what makes it genuinely unsettling, is a simple fact. It wasn't an isolated incident. From 1850 through 1903, photographers working across 3 separate continents recorded aerial objects that matched nothing in the technological inventory of their time. These weren't static marks on glass plates. They moved. They hovered. They appeared in multiple exposures, taken years apart, in locations separated by thousands of miles. And their flight paths suggested something deliberate, something guided, rather than atmospheric drift or darkroom artifacts. The standard dismissals have always been tidy enough: lens defects, stray light bleeding into the exposure, reflections off glass elements, birds rendered shapeless by long shutter times, dust on the lens surface, simple errors by operators still mastering an infant technology. But when you actually study these photographs, when you cross-reference the technical capabilities of the equipment used with the credentials of the people behind the lens, those neat explanations begin to fracture. These were not amateurs stumbling through early experiments. These photographers ranked among the most skilled practitioners alive, operating the best instruments available under conditions they deliberately selected for clarity. Every one of them recorded objects that had no right to appear in their frames. The equipment constraints make these captures harder to explain, not easier. Photography became commercially practical in the 1840s through the daguerreotype process. By 1850, wet plate collodion had pushed image quality dramatically forward. Fine architectural detail, delicate gradations of light, even subjects in motion, all could be rendered with striking precision. The cameras were large, cumbersome, and demanded real technical skill. But they worked. They produced faithful records of what stood before them. That reliability is precisely what makes the anomalies in certain plates so difficult to wave away. The Mount Washington exposure from 1870 remains the earliest, rigorously documented case. But it was hardly the first. In 1856, a French photographic artist named Pierre-Gustave Tour was methodically recording industrial development along the Seine River near Rouen. A textile manufacturer had commissioned him to document the expanding factory quarter. Tour's reputation rested on exacting precision. He had trained under one of Daguerre's own students. He'd spent a full decade refining his technique. Courts accepted his photographs as legal evidence in property disputes. That was the degree of trust his work commanded. In one of those industrial plates, exposed on a cloudless August afternoon, something appears in the sky above the factory rooftops. Cylindrical in form, darker than the surrounding clouds, angled sharply upward. The object is rendered with a crispness inconsistent with a bird caught during Tour's typical exposure durations. No motion blur, no feathered edges. It casts no visible shadow on the cloud layer below, which implies substantial altitude. But the most significant detail isn't the object itself. It's the methodology behind the capture. Tour captured 3 separate photographs from the exact same vantage point that afternoon. He deliberately bracketed his exposures to cover the full tonal range of the scene. The object appears in all three plates, but in slightly different positions. That detail matters. It indicates movement across roughly 15 minutes between shots. This photograph stayed in private hands for nearly a century. Researchers didn't surface it until the 1950s. When analytical specialists examined the original glass plates, they found no signs of tampering, no double exposure, no manipulation of any kind. The anomalous object was burned directly into the original negative, identical to what the positive prints display. But here's what caught my attention. Tor himself never wrote a single word about it. His personal notes make no reference to anything unusual in the sky that day. An artist of his technical precision, someone who meticulously bracketed 3 exposures of the same scene, you'd expect at least a passing observation, some attempt at explanation. His journals offer nothing. Only the plates themselves testify to what was there. This pattern doesn't stay in Rouen. It repeats across entirely different locations, involving unrelated photographers over the next 5 decades. In 1862, James Wallace Black produced what's broadly recognized as the first aerial photograph taken in the United States. He shot it from a tethered hot air balloon hovering 1,200 feet above Boston. The image delivers a strikingly clear view of the downtown area. It also captures 2 distant objects that don't match the visual profile of other balloons. They're disproportionately small, unusually dark, and their apparent trajectory runs counter to the recorded wind patterns of that day. Black noted in his journal that he spotted other balloons during his ascent. These 2 entities behaved differently. They weren't tethered, they appeared to move under their own power. Then in 1870, the same year as the Mount Washington photograph, a series of images emerged from a sweeping photographic survey of the western United States. The federal government had commissioned this project specifically to document mineral deposits and viable railway routes. The photographers they chose were seasoned professionals, selected for their advanced technical skill. William Henry Jackson was among them. He'd later gain wide recognition for his landscape photography of Yellowstone, images instrumental in convincing Congress to establish the nation's first national park. Over the course of that survey, Jackson and his team produced at least 7 photographs containing unexplained aerial objects. These appeared in plates shot across Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. The forms varied considerably. Some read as spherical, others appeared disc-like. A few carried an almost triangular geometry, yet certain characteristics held constant across all of them. Everyone was dark against bright sky, each rendered with sharp definition, no motion blur whatsoever, and all appeared at altitudes far above any terrestrial feature in the frame. What makes these survey photographs particularly significant is the documentation infrastructure surrounding them. The teams kept exhaustive logs, weather conditions, exposure settings, specific technical notes for every single plate. They recorded wind speeds, cloud formations, any atmospheric irregularities they observed. I want to be precise here. In the records corresponding to several photographs that captured these objects, there is no mention of anything unusual. None. The photographers logged clear skies, excellent visibility, optimal conditions for shooting, which means one of 2 things. Either these objects were invisible to the unaided eye, or the photographers simply didn't notice them until development revealed what the plates had recorded. That distinction carries weight either way, and it raises a deeply uncomfortable question. How many other glass plate negatives from this period might contain similar, anomalous objects that no one ever thought to look for. These survey photographs were examined again and again during the expedition itself and for years afterward. Yet the aerial anomalies went unnoticed until researchers launched a systematic review of historical photographic archives in the 1960s. How many other photographic collections sitting in museums and historical societies contain evidence of this same phenomenon? Evidence that has gone unexamined for over a century. In 1883, an astronomer at the Zacatecas Observatory in Mexico photographed what he described as a spindle-shaped object crossing the solar disk. José Bonilla had been conducting routine solar observations when he first assumed these entities were birds or insects drifting past his telescope. But as he continued watching, he realized these objects occupied an altitude and distance far beyond anything biological. Over 2 days, he managed to photograph 447 of them. The images showed dark, elongated forms, each transiting the sun along the same directional vector at roughly the same altitude. Bonilla published his findings in a Mexican scientific journal. The international astronomical community barely noticed. The dominant explanation at the time suggested he'd captured a flock of geese at high altitude, or perhaps wind-borne debris from a volcanic eruption. But contemporary analysis of Bonilla's photographs, using advanced image processing, places these objects at a minimum altitude of 250 miles. That is beyond Earth's atmosphere. That is space. Each object measured between 150 and 450 meters in length. Birds do not fly through vacuum. Volcanic ejecta does not hold cohesive formation across 2 days of sustained observation. The pattern continues into the 1890s. In 1894, a photographer in Guernsey documented a regatta in the English Channel. The photograph shows sailing vessels and spectator boats, all captured with the sharp clarity that defined marine photography of the era. It also captures 3 objects positioned in the sky above the fleet. They sit in a distinct triangular formation, dark, disc-shaped, clearly at considerable altitude above the vessels below. Richard Nafala was an experienced marine photographic artist, thoroughly familiar with reflections, lens flares, and the optical distortions common to his craft. He provided no explanation for their presence in his image. Between 1896 and 1897, a strange sequence of events swept across the United States. Newspapers in more than a dozen states reported sightings of what people called __, quote, _0, __. Thousands of witnesses described large, illuminated, dirigible-like craft moving over cities and farmland, often after dark. The descriptions varied widely. Cigar-shaped vessels, triangular configurations, some with propellers, others with visible cabin structures. Most of these reports were dismissed. Mass hysteria, misidentified planets and stars, outright fabrication. But during this same window of widespread eyewitness accounts, several photographers captured images of objects that closely matched what witnesses were describing. A photograph taken in Omaha in April of 1897 shows a dark, elongated object above the city's skyline. Another from Fort Worth, same month, reveals what appears to be a structured craft with a pronounced pointed frontal section. Though the grainy quality of these nighttime photographs complicates definitive analysis, their existence is undeniable. Local photographers produced these records, No discernible motivation for hoaxes has surfaced among them. The dominant skeptical framework labeled this Airship Wave, a collective delusion. Sensationalized newspaper stories supposedly primed ordinary people to misidentify Venus or Jupiter as extraordinary craft. But this explanation runs into a concrete problem. The phenomenon appeared before the newspaper coverage spread. The earliest credible reports came from isolated rural communities in California. Witnesses with no connections to one another limited access to papers carrying these narratives. The media followed the sightings, not the other way around.
And the photographic evidence,
Rudimentary as it is, suggests that at least some of these witnesses were documenting physical objects. By 1903, the year the Wright brothers achieved controlled, sustained, powered, heavier-than-air flight at Kitty Hawk, the photographic record already contained multiple images of aerial objects displaying what appeared to be advanced flight characteristics. The historical paradox here is precise. If these objects were sophisticated aircraft, then powered flight was achieved by an unknown party, using technology that left almost no other trace. No patents, no experimental facilities, no documented development programs, no accidental discoveries, no public demonstrations, only scattered photographs and eyewitness accounts. If these objects were not aircraft, then what exactly were photographers capturing? The most straightforward alternative, natural phenomena. Unusual cloud formations, atmospheric optical effects, celestial bodies distorted by rare conditions. Observers lacking the scientific vocabulary to categorize what they saw. This explanation might cover some of the photographic anomalies. It does not cover all of them. It cannot account for the structural detail visible in certain images. It cannot explain objects appearing across multiple photographs with clear positional changes. And it offers no mechanism for why these phenomena clustered within specific time windows and geographic regions. A third possibility demands attention, though it resists comfortable analysis. That these objects were exactly what they appeared to be, aerial craft, not human-made. 19th century aviation technology could not produce anything remotely resembling what these photographs depict. If the photographic evidence warrants serious consideration, then we're confronting something specific. An individual or entity operating advanced aircraft over multiple nations for at least 50 years before humanity achieved powered flight. That is not a minor footnote. That fundamentally destabilizes the established timeline. If we accept these photographs as records of genuine objects, actual craft of some description, then several questions become unavoidable. Origin, creator, and the systematic absence of corroborating physical evidence. These craft appeared intermittently across 5 decades, yet left no wreckage, no crash sites, no recoverable components, nothing but images and testimony. The economic implications alone are staggering. If advanced aircraft existed between the 1850s and 1890s, the entire Industrial Revolution unfolded beneath a technology that was never adopted, never reverse-engineered, never commercially exploited. It would mean that aviation history, as conventionally understood, the careful progression from gliders to powered aircraft to modern jets, ran parallel to something demonstrably more advanced. A technology that somehow remained invisible to the very engineers, inventors, and industrialists who were desperately pursuing the problem of flight. Think about the economic landscape for a moment. Railroads were rewriting the rules of commerce, minting fortunes almost overnight. Steam power was transforming manufacturing at its core. Telegraph cables were stitching the globe together. This was a period defined by aggressive technological absorption. If someone had demonstrated a working aircraft in 1870, capital would have flooded in immediately. Military procurement would have followed within months. Commercial deployment would have been inevitable. The financial incentives were staggering. And yet, these objects show up in photographs, get witnessed by thousands during the Airship Wave. And then, nothing happens. No patents filed, no corporations formed, no defense contracts awarded. The only economic explanation that holds up is straightforward. The technology was never available for adoption. But if these craft belong to an entity with zero interest in profit, no motivation toward military partnerships, no desire to compete with railroads or steamships, something functioning more as an observer of human economic development than a participant in it, then the pattern actually makes sense. Modern forensic tools have allowed researchers to examine these historical images at a resolution the original photographers could never have imagined. Digital enhancement, resolution scaling, and geometric analysis of object positioning and dimensions have produced some genuinely striking findings. First, multiple objects display consistent geometric proportions across photographic records separated by decades and thousands of miles. Disc-shaped objects, where they appear, tend to exhibit diameter-to-thickness ratios that cluster within narrow parameters. That implies one of two things: either a shared natural phenomenon generating these shapes, or a common engineering methodology behind manufactured artifacts. Natural atmospheric formations capable of producing disc-like shapes, lenticular clouds being the obvious candidate, do not hold sharp edges and uniform proportions across varying weather conditions. Manufactured objects would. Second, these objects demonstrate what engineers call quote, two, underscore. When the same object appears in sequential photographs from a single session, shifting slightly in position, it maintains its orientation relative to the ground. It doesn't tumble. It doesn't spin randomly the way a balloon or wind-carried debris would. This points to either extraordinarily unusual atmospheric conditions providing inherent stabilization, or active control systems maintaining orientation. I want to be precise here. In 1870, basic gyroscopic stabilization existed for maritime navigation. Practical application to airborne platforms was still decades from realization. Third, several of these photographs capture objects at altitudes that resist conventional explanation entirely. The Mount Washington photograph was made from an elevation of 6,288 feet. The object in that image sits above the photographer's position. That places its minimum altitude somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 feet. At that height in 1870, there was nothing, absolutely nothing, of human manufacture capable of sustained flight. Birds can reach those altitudes on rare occasions, but the object in the photograph bears no resemblance to any avian form or flight behavior. The observations recorded by José Bonilla in 1883 pushed the problem even further. If the altitude calculations hold, and modern analysis strongly indicates they do, then he was photographing objects in space. In 1883, objects that appeared to move in formation, holding consistent spacing and orientation across a 2-day observation window. A meteor shower doesn't explain this. Meteors don't fly in formation. They don't maintain uniform shapes. They don't cross the solar disk at steady velocities over extended periods. Then there's the geographical clustering. These photographic occurrences aren't distributed evenly across the globe. They concentrate in specific regions. The western United States shows a particularly high density during the 1870s survey expeditions. The English Channel and northern France produce multiple incidents spanning the 1860s through 1890s. Central Mexico yields prominent examples in the 1880s. These clusters defy easy explanation. They don't correlate with population density. They don't track with photographic activity levels. Some of the most photographically saturated regions of the era, London, New York, show remarkably few of these anomalous images. Then there's the temporal pattern, difficult to disregard. The phenomenon seems to intensify in the 1850s, climbs toward a zenith during the 1890s Airship Wave, and then largely vanishes by the early 1900s. That timing aligns precisely with the dawn of practical human aviation, as though whatever had been operating overhead for half a century stopped once humanity began flying on its own. Maybe that's coincidence. Or maybe the operators of these craft concluded their observational window once humans independently achieved flight. The economic dimension deepens the puzzle when you examine who was witnessing these phenomena and where. Railroad surveyors cutting through remote Western territories, industrial photographers methodically documenting factory expansion, astronomers stationed at isolated observatories, crews aboard seafaring vessels. These are not environments that breed hoaxes or mass hysteria. These were seasoned professionals, often working alone or in small teams, with no discernible motivation to fabricate narratives or forge photographic evidence. And here's what's worth noting. They were positioned in locations ideally suited for monitoring early economic and industrial development. If the objective was studying an emerging industrial civilization, these are exactly the vantage points one would choose. Railroad construction was unlocking vast territories, laying transportation infrastructure for continental commerce. Factories were rewriting manufacturing paradigms, seeding new industrial centers. Astronomical observation was extending humanity's grasp of the cosmos. Shipping lanes were stitching continents into an increasingly unified global economy. The technological gap is staggering. The Wright Flyer of 1903 relied on a custom-built gasoline engine generating 12 horsepower. Meticulously engineered wings with specific airfoil profiles. A sophisticated control system using wing warping and movable rudders. An exceptionally lightweight frame of spruce wood and muslin fabric. Its inaugural flight lasted 12 seconds. It covered 120 feet. The objects captured in these historical photographs appear to operate at significant altitudes. They demonstrate sustained hovering capability. They maintain stable flight across varied atmospheric conditions. Their structural configurations resemble nothing from the nascent era of aviation. For secret innovators to have built such craft between the 1850s and 1890s, they would have needed to solve every problem that consumed the Wright brothers, Glenn Curtiss, Alberto Santos Dumont, and dozens of others across years of dedicated effort. They would have needed propulsion systems that didn't exist, materials that weren't commercially available, fabrication techniques that wouldn't emerge for decades. And they would have achieved all of this without wind tunnels, without systematic aerodynamic research, without the painstaking accumulated knowledge that aviation pioneers slowly built upon. The financial requirements alone would have been enormous. Early aviation trailblazers poured substantial fortunes into developing their machines. The Wright brothers funded their work through a bicycle business and operated under constant financial strain. These pioneers worked in full public view, filed patents, demonstrated their aircraft openly, and still struggled to secure investors and buyers. The economic logic collapses under its own weight. If someone in the 1850s or 1860s had engineered sophisticated aerial craft, funded decades of research, conducted testing programs, operated over populated areas in full daylight, secrecy makes no sense. You don't hide a breakthrough like that. You patent it. You attract investors. You build a company. The military applications alone would have been worth millions. Commercial freight and passenger transit would have reshaped entire economies. Every incentive pointed toward disclosure and commercialization. The pressure to reveal was overwhelming. And yet, nothing substantial. Photographs, scattered eyewitness accounts. Then, silence. This forces a deeper question about how we reconstruct the past from surviving evidence. We have photographic documentation, we have first-hand observer testimony, we have recorded observations from trained specialists working with calibrated instruments. By any standard measure of historical research, this material demands serious examination. But it fundamentally contradicts our accepted technological development. So it gets set aside, quietly disregarded. The default response is to challenge the evidence itself. Perhaps the photographs were manipulated. Perhaps the witnesses were confused. Perhaps some natural explanation hasn't been identified yet. That's reasonable skepticism. I want to be precise here. But when you apply it uniformly, problems emerge. Many of these photographic records come from sources whose credibility is otherwise unquestioned. Government survey photographers whose remaining work is accepted without hesitation. Professional astronomers whose celestial observations form the backbone of accepted science. Commercial photographers whose technical skill no one disputes. The witness testimony proves harder to dismiss than most assume. The airship sighting wave between 1896 and 1897 produced thousands of reports across multiple states. Some observers were certainly mistaken. Planets, stars, atmospheric tricks. But specific reports involved multiple witnesses. Daylight conditions. Detailed structural descriptions of craft observed at close range. Among those witnesses, former military officers, newspaper editors, law enforcement officials, scientists. These were not credulous people chasing shadows after dark. They were trained professionals making careful, specific observations. When you layer the photographic evidence alongside witness accounts and astronomical data from researchers like Bonilla, something accumulates that resists easy dismissal. Something was happening. The real question is, what precisely? And this is not buried material. The photographs sit in archives. The newspaper reports are preserved in library collections. The astronomical observations were published in scientific journals. All of it is accessible